How much does missing out on Alabama safety Caleb Downs really hurt this Georgia secondary? And I think it's, a little bit safer to start out by remembering before Nick Saban decided to retire, which was to an extent surprising. Caleb Downs wasn't supposed to come to Georgia, right? He would have been at Alabama still. So this was an unexpected thing that kind of happened, and obviously the signs pointed towards Georgia with Caleb Downs. I think that once I got that Bleacher Report notification a few days ago that said Caleb Downs was visiting Ohio State, that's when I kind of knew, hey, look, man, this thing's probably over. Kid wanted to go to Ohio State anyway out of high school, more so than Georgia in the first place. I'm sure that they came up with whatever the price it was that he wanted, and now he's there. How much does this hurt Georgia, though? Look, putting Caleb Downs next to Malachi Starks back there, I've said it. I don't know if I've said it on camera here yet, but I've said to people behind the scenes and just people in general, I don't know that Georgia would have ever had a safety duo as talented as the combination of Starks and Downs. And both guys, they're within an hour from Athens. There definitely is a hometown aspect to it, but you don't really get that many athletes back there, right, that are that good. And Caleb Downs' production was obviously impressive, over 100 tackles, a couple picks, some pass deflections. Dude was all over the place. He could return kicks, right? That's what you get with Malachi Starks. It would have been having two of them back there is what you would have gotten. And it would have been sick. But look, he's going to Ohio State. Ohio State obviously houses some pretty good DBs as well as Alabama, Georgia, and the LSUs of the world. What does Georgia have to do? Well, they have to replace a couple of guys in the secondary in Javon Bullard, Tyke Smith, and not a couple, three. Because Georgia, for the most part, runs a defensive set that has 5 defensive backs in it. When you talk about 2 corners, 2 safeties, and a nickel slot guy, right? Call it what you want between a safety and corner. They call it the star, and that was Tyke Smith this past year. So they got to replace the star. They got to replace your number 1 corner in Kamari Lassiter, and you got to replace one of your safeties back there in Javon Bullard. How are they going to do that? I'm going to sit here and try to figure that out a little bit. Ryan Curley from Dawg Post here, talking about Georgia's secondary in the wake of the Caleb Downs news that he's going to Ohio State, and it really did seem like there for a second that he would come to Georgia. Between Tavares Robinson and him entering the transfer portal and him being a hometown kid, the reports that he was here, right? That we were hearing that he did at the very minimum come over to Athens to take a visit. So things were looking like it was going in Georgia's direction, but that's not what's happening. And so we're going to move on from Caleb Downs, and he's no longer the part of this discussion now. You've got a couple of guys who are older who may end up playing a lot this coming year. I think that there's definitely some discussion warranted about possible spring transfers. I think by my count, Georgia would be over the scholarship limit right now, and I think sometimes those things can be a little bit muddy. I would expect after spring competitions happen, people lose out on jobs maybe they thought they were going to win. I would expect a couple of dogs to transfer out after the spring, after G-Day and all of that. I think that it's reasonable to expect maybe a couple of guys to leave. Is that going to be the case in the secondary? I don't know. You can maybe take a guess at someone that might happen with. Because think about a couple of these safeties, David Daniels, Sisavon, and Dan Jackson. Those are the 2 older guys in this room that have played in significant games, right? And Dan Jackson, and more so than David Daniel. I mean, Dan Jackson was out there playing significant snaps with that 2021 defense, making plays. He started games for Georgia. David Daniel, not quite the same level of experience, but a guy that he excites you in run situations. A guy that comes up and is a heavy hitter. I remember making a really good play against Ohio State. No, 2 seasons back. It seems there's a bird chirping out my window. That actually scared me a little bit. I remember him making a pretty big play, I believe, in run stop against Ohio State a couple years ago. He's a guy that's a heavy hitter, but a guy that has struggled a little bit in pass coverage for Georgia. Those are the 2 older names that you have to look at replacing Javon Bullard, right, back there in that secondary spot. To me, it seems that Georgia likes to groom, and you've got to groom younger players into certain positions over time in football, and Georgia does that. And it seems that star position they've been grooming Jonel Aguero for it. Obviously a 5-star, right? In last year's class, he was a true freshman. He was wearing number 8. If you ever saw him on the field, he was wearing number 8 on that defense. He's a guy that obviously you haven't seen a lot of him. I think he only tallied like 7. He did not have 10 tackles this past year. Obviously, a guy that was not out there a lot because you had a former All-American and a guy that was productive for Georgia this season playing that position in Tyke Smith. So he was the interception leader for Georgia. He was all over the place. And Tyke Smith had his bad moments, and he had a lot of great moments. And now he'll have to get replaced. And I think it'll be Janelle Aguero that they replace him at this spot. They want, look, from an athletic standpoint, that'd be an upgrade. All right, Janelle Aguero, I think, is a more impressive athlete than Tyke Smith. So from an athletic standpoint, you're getting an upgrade. Obviously, you aren't from an experience standpoint, but that's what it looks like is going to happen at that position for Georgia. Obviously, look, spring ball's not that far away, like a month and a half from me getting to get into practice and start to see where these position battles are. We're really not that far from spring practice content for you guys. So we're going to try to pack in as much other stuff as we can ahead of that. And then you move back to that other spot. That's where I think it's a little bit more muddy, because if I had to guess, I would guess that Janelle Aguero ends up being the star for Georgia. And that fills one of the spots. What are the two other spots? What's going to happen there? Well, I think that with the corners, to me, it seems a little easier. It seems like you can fill in Dalen Everett and Julian Humphrey. Right? Dalen Everett worked as the cornerback 2 like 95% of the time. Obviously, Julian Humphrey started roping in more and more as the season went on. A guy that was a true battle for the cornerback 2 spot in the offseason between those two guys. Dalen Everett pretty much won that out, but it kind of felt as the year went on that maybe Julian Humphrey was playing a little bit better. Maybe Julian Humphrey was going to take his spot. I believe it was in the Missouri or the Ole Miss game. There were a couple different important injuries for Georgia over those 2 weeks. Obviously, Jamon Dumas-Johnson getting hurt against Missouri, and Julian Humphrey, I'm blanking on which game he got hurt in, but obviously hurts an upper body part. Right? They never really specified his exact injury following that game. It felt like he was kind of taking over Dalen Everett's job right before our eyes in that game. It felt like, oh man, maybe Julian Humphrey might be the starter there. So now I think it'll be those two guys on the outside at your cornerback positions. That'd be my guess. There are a couple of freshman corners that are very impressive, and obviously when you talk about a guy like Ellis Robinson that's a top 5 prospect, there is definitely some thought, oh, maybe we got to get this guy out there. If he's talented and he's ready, he will be out there on the field. And that's the same thing for KJ Bolton, DeMello Jones, any of the other young corners or safeties that you feel. Right? At the moment, I don't think they're going to get much playing time on the field, but obviously these guys are really talented. It feels like there's a lot of excitement, comparatively speaking, to this secondary class, and I get it. And obviously the KJ Bolton flip was a more dramatic piece to cover over this time, and obviously we know a lot about the KJ Bolton recruitment, and it was interesting, but he is another 5-star that you add to Georgia's secondary. So behind these guys, you've got a lot of talent. At the other safety spot, this is something I'm going back to now about replacing Javon Bullard. All right, I already discussed Dan Jackson and David Daniel Sisvon. Another name to keep an eye on is Ja'Cory Thomas, younger guy. He's wearing number 20 for Georgia. He got some playing time here and there. He's another one of those guys that, he has to fill in during garbage time. He's not out there a ton. He doesn't have production, right? I'm looking at the box score. He doesn't have real production, but a younger guy that they're excited about. He's one of the guys that stuck around. Georgia's had some guys in the secondary transfer out over the last couple of years. Ja'Cory Thomas is not one of them. So it's a 3-headed battle there at one of those safety spots, in my opinion. That's kind of disregarding the freshmen a little bit in this conversation. I could be wrong. I mean, maybe KJ Bolton comes in and they impress. He impresses the coaches, and they have to start him day one. That was the case with Malachi Starks a year prior, right? Malachi Starks was the guy, and we kind of knew that Malachi Starks was going to have an opportunity to start, especially with the safety turnover that Georgia was having in Lewis Cine, right? Malachi Starks was replacing Lewis Cine. Well, KJ Bolton has an opportunity to beat out these guys and maybe be the starting safety back there next to Malachi Starks. Georgia's not afraid to start a freshman if they feel that he is the best player for the job. So this video wasn't meant to disregard those players, right? Ellis Robinson, the talent's obviously there. He could come in and be better than possibly both Dalen Everett and Julian Humphrey. You can't really know until you get to that point and they actually start battling it out. Georgia's secondary, what has this boiled down to, and my point of making this video, if you made it this far with me, Georgia's secondary I think is fine. They've got plenty of talent around Malachi Starks, who seems to be the centerpiece of their defense, not just their secondary, right? He's one of the best football players in the country, He's one of the best players in the sport. So they've got the talent, even if Caleb Downs isn't there. Yes, would things have been a lot simpler and it would have been plug and play with Caleb Downs? You got that. And I'm realizing now that I didn't talk about Jake Pope that much. And that's because I don't know if he's going to come in and win the job. I think that there's a reason why they offered him and everything. It's interesting to me what would have happened with him coming over from Alabama if Caleb Downs also came over from Alabama, because what we saw over there was just that Caleb Downs was ahead of Jake Pope. So is he a guy that's going to come in and just take that secondary spot right away, right? That's another guy who, we're just not sure about. Didn't play a ton his freshman year against Alabama or at Alabama. Obviously, Georgia was in the mix for his commitment. He's a Buford kid. Is he going to come in and just take the job? So I think there's true competition in the secondary. I just don't know exactly who's going to win the job at the moment. If I had to map this thing out, though, it'd be Dalen Everett and Julian Humphrey. You'd have Aguero in there at the star. And then next to Malachi Starks, it's kind of a four-headed battle between Ja'Cory Thomas, a five-headed battle if you want to throw in KJ Bolton, Ja'Cory Thomas, Jake Pope, David Daniel-Sisavon, Dan Jackson. There's five guys that are really vying for that safety spot, and that's possibly the most fun competition that there will be during the spring, and we'll have to look out for, and definitely something we'll cover more in depth moving forward. Thank you for watching, and make sure you're checking out our newsletter down below.